We don't know what the chain of custody is. This could have been an Israeli false flag operation. It could have been an opposition in Syria, and one wonders what part of the opposition, false flag operation, or it could have been an actual use by Bashar al-Assad. But we certainly don't know with the evidence we've been given, and what I'm hearing from the intelligence community is that that evidence is really flaky.
Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction.
That, of course, was the embarrassing presentation of Colin Powell at the United Nations before the Iraq War. Later on, he would have some regrets about that war, of course. And now we're faced with another situation where we might have to go to war in the Middle East again. That's partly because President Obama had drawn a red line on Syria using chemical weapons, and then it appeared they used chemical weapons. Now, when asked about that red line, President Obama said this.
What we now have is evidence that chemical weapons have been used inside of Syria, but we don't know how they were used, when they were used, who used them. We don't have a chain of custody that establishes what exactly happened. And when I am making decisions about America's national security and the potential for taking additional action in response to chemical weapon use, I've got to make sure I've got the facts.
So should we go to war in Syria or should we not? Well, let me bring in an incredible expert, Colonel Wilkerson. He was the former chief of staff for Colin Powell during the Bush administration. He served 31 years in the U.S. Army, and now he's a professional lecturer in the honors program at George Washington University. Great to have you with us, Colonel Wilkerson.
Good to be here.
So first on the issue of Syria, it is an awfully difficult one. We did draw a red line. It seems that they have crossed it. On the other hand, it doesn't seem like the country's got an appetite for another war in the Middle East. What do you make of it, and how would you handle it, or how would you advise if you were still part of the administration?
I think the president's statement, which you just played, was very circumspect, very prudent. We don't know what the chain of custody is. This could have been an Israeli false flag operation. It could have been an opposition in Syria, and one wonders what part of the opposition, false flag operation, or it could have been an actual use by Bashar al-Assad. But we certainly don't know with the evidence we've been given, and what I'm hearing from the intelligence community is that that evidence is really flaky. So there's no way I would say my red line had been crossed and start something serious in terms of U.S. intervention based on this very flimsy evidence.
That's really interesting. You think there's at least some chance that it might have been an Israeli false flag operation? Why would they do that? What would be the motivation there?
I think we've got basically a geostrategically, geopolitical, if you will, inept regime in Tel Aviv right now. I think we saw really startling evidence of that in the fact that President Obama had to tell Bibi Netanyahu, pick up the phone, you idiot, and call Ankara and get yourself out of this strategic isolation you're in right now. Do a reconciliation with Turkey, the most powerful country in the region. Otherwise, Bibi probably would never have done it. Look at Israel's situation right now. It is as dangerous as it's been since 1948. You've got Lebanon growing increasingly unstable with Nasrallah and Hezbollah having more and more political power. You've got Syria involved in a brutal civil war. You've got Iraq in Iran's back pocket with Nouri al-Maliki, the Sunnis realizing that and restarting the civil war. You've got Saudi Arabia funding the Sunnis in Iraq. You've got Jordan, whose king has publicly said he wished he weren't the king. You've got Egypt in an untenable position, no longer the security that Israel needed on that flank. So Israel's in very, very dangerous situation right now. The president's got to be very circumspect about what he does in exacerbating that situation. Netanyahu is clueless as to this. I hope President Obama gave him a lecture in geostrategic realities.
So if you were in Netanyahu's position and you think Israel's situation is precarious, what would you do, especially in regards to Syria and Iran, which appear to be significant issues, obviously, in that region?
The first thing I'd do is stop things that are actions, policies that are creating this pariah status for Israel and this isolated status. first step he took was a good one, to seek rapprochement with Ankara and to reaffirm the relationship between Turkey and Israel. The second thing I would do is, I don't care if you're serious about it or not, you've got to put some prima facie evidence out there that you are. I'd resume serious efforts to get going with the Israeli-Palestinian dialogue over Jerusalem, over borders, over return of refugees, all the things that we've talked about for the past 30 years in the Middle East peace process. I would at least be smart enough to let somebody know that there was something about Israel other than expansionist settlement activity. I understand he's got a problem with his constituencies, because 1 out of every 5 Israelis is now a settler. But that's what politics is all about. That's what leadership is all about. Netanyahu needs to exercise some.
Final question on Syria for you, Colonel. If you're in President Obama's shoes, is there any condition under which you would use the Air Force in Syria? I assume you wouldn't commit ground troops, but using the Air Force, would that be a possibility? Under what circumstance for you?
I understand you're probably referring to a no-fly zone,
yep.
And I don't see that as being tenable. If you look at the geography, you look at the way you would have to establish it from sea and air, you look at the airfields available, you look at what you'd have to fly against potentially, particularly with the Russians having the potential to sell the latest air defense weapons to Syria, which heretofore I think they've refrained from doing. You look at the possibility of other parties becoming involved in this conflict. I think that's a step I wouldn't take right now. The war is brutal, and there have been many deaths. I think the best we can do is to continue to back efforts to bring about a ceasefire, to bring about a settlement. And I think Assad's sticking around a lot longer than anyone predicted. Incidentally, I predicted he would. And I think it's a much more difficult situation than many people on both sides give it credit for being. And I would also emphasize that Syria and Iran are one right now, partly because of our policies in the past. So if you want a backdoor into war with Iran, you go through Syria. And that's what people like Lindsey Graham and John McCain and Bob Menendez are trying to effect, is war with Iran. They don't really care about Syria. What they want is Iran.
All right, that's really interesting. Now, I also want to move on to one other topic that's very important. That's Guantanamo. Now, I want to give you some numbers about that. We've got about 100 people who are doing a hunger strike there. We've got 86 people who are slated for release but are not being released. They should be free to go, but we won't let them go. And then we've got 46 people in a category where we say we are never going to try them and we are never going to release them. We will indefinitely detain them without ever giving them a trial. Look, I'm going to use harsh language here, but that sounds like a Guantanamo gulag. What should President Obama do about that?
Well, he should do a lot more than just throw his rhetoric out as he did the other day. I was stunned at the statements he made, because most of the statements he made decrying things are things that he has indeed created himself. So the first thing I would do is let those people go who have been judged by everyone, the military included, as not being guilty of anything. Let them go. With the 50 or so people who are probably hardcore terrorists, I'd move them into U.S. prisons. They'll be safe as a dollar there. And I would keep them there, and I would turn it over to Congress. I'd put the onus on the Congress. I'd say, if you don't like the fact we haven't given them due process, if you don't like the fact this is indefinite detention, do something about it, Congress. I've moved them into federal prisons. That would get us out of the stigma of being on some other country's soil. It would eliminate Gitmo altogether and eliminate a real problem in our foreign policy with other countries around the world right now. This is not a difficult problem now. This is a problem that could be solved. It could be solved by the president. So I don't get the fact that he's out decrying the Congress and other issues when, in fact, he can settle this issue himself.
But Colonel Wilkerson, President Obama would say, you don't understand. You know, I would love to close it, and that's why I gave the speech that I did the other day. That's why I put it as one of my campaign promises back in 2008. But the Republicans are demagoguing on it, and they're scaring people. So the politics of it are too hard. How would you respond to that?
I'd simply tell them we've got, as I understand it, over 300 terrorists, some of them really bad guys, in federal prison right now. None of them have escaped. None of them have caused the system any problem. So a few more is not going to hurt. The big problem is going to be what to do with them in the long run. And as I said, this may sound Machiavellian, but I'd play some Machiavelli if I were President Obama. I'd put that on the Congress's back. I'd say these people are in our prisons. If you don't like it, do something about it.
All right. And then finally, President Bush unveiled his library. You were, of course, a member of the Bush administration as Colin Powell's chief of staff. Were you invited, and would you have liked to have gone?
I wasn't invited, but I went, so to speak. I was in Dallas. I was giving a speech at the University of Dallas. And one of the things I was saying was that I was stunned when I heard Bush outside the library say, and this is almost a direct quote, "I want people to be able to go to this library and see that we lived up to our convictions." And I was taken aback, because what were our convictions? Our convictions were we torture people. Our convictions that we abandoned Geneva, an instrument largely of our own making. Our convictions were that we waged a war of choice, perhaps even an illegal war in Iraq. Our convictions were Guantanamo. What are these convictions you want people to see, President Bush? I think probably the library has obfuscated all that, if not totally wiped it out, and made people who go in there think that the Bush administration was normal and not a bizarre one. Well, I can tell you it was a bizarre one.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, he was there, so he would know. Thank you so much for joining us on the Young Turks. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. Now, when we come back, we've got a lot more for you. We're going to switch topics entirely. Jody Arias